It is the 10th of January, 1870. In Cleveland, Ohio, a 30-year-old businessman and his partners incorporate the Standard Oil Company. Over the coming years, they build on their initial $1 million investment by buying up smaller oil companies and refineries across Ohio and beyond, so that by 1890, Standard Oil is worth $100 million and controls over 90% of U.S. oil production. By the time he retires, the company's founder is, for better or worse, one of the richest and most influential men in the history of the United States and indeed the world. His name, J.D. Rockefeller, the world's first billionaire. The man known to history as John D. Rockefeller was born John Davison Rockefeller on the 8th of July, 1839, in the small town of Richest in New York State. The Rockefellers arrived in North America around 1723, when Johann Peter Rockefeller and his family migrated from the Rhine Valley in western Germany to New Jersey, later relocating to New York State. John's father, William or Bill Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who described himself as a botanic physician or herbal doctor, a euphemism for his habit of making fake medicines from herbs in his mother's garden and claiming their potency to cure all sorts of ailments. Quack doctors of this kind were very common in the early 19th century. An all-round con artist, William subsequently used the money he made from selling his supposed medicines to loan out money at usurious rates to poor farmers, often with the specific aim of later acquiring their properties when they could not pay him back. An unscrupulous character, he would later be arraigned in court for sexual assault and violent conduct involving gun possession. In late 1836, while William Rockefeller was roving around the countryside near Richest, he met Eliza Davison and charmed her with his wild tales. In February 1837, the couple were married, despite the fact that Bill was already engaged to a beautiful but penniless woman named Nancy Brown. Eliza Rockefeller was the youngest daughter of John Davison, a rich farmer who lived between Niles and Moravia in New York State, some 30 miles to the north. Eliza's mother had died when she was a child, after taking a pill sold by a man claiming to be a traveling doctor. John Davison, a Scots-Irish man, was accordingly quite suspicious of his daughter's desire to marry Bill Rockefeller, whom he believed was seeking to get hold of the family's money and who appeared to be a quack doctor selling the kind of unsafe potions and pills that had led to his wife's death many years earlier. After moving in with her husband, Eliza found herself sharing the same roof as Nancy Brown, whom Bill had engaged as his housekeeper. It was soon apparent that Nancy's duties went beyond her job description, and over the next 2 years, Bill would welcome 4 children, 2 each from wife and mistress. Eliza had a daughter named Lucy and a son named John, the future oil magnate, while Nancy gave birth to 2 girls. Although Eliza pitied Nancy, and the 2 women maintained cordial relations during William's often prolonged absences from home, the Davisons eventually forced Bill to send Nancy back to her parents with her 2 illegitimate daughters in tow. Following their departure, Eliza gave birth to another son, William Jr., with her husband often away for several months at a time. Eliza ran a frugal household. When John was 3 years old, the family moved to Moravia, 3 miles away from the Davison farm. In 1843, Eliza gave birth to another daughter, Mary Ann, and in 1845, twins, Frank and Frances, the latter of whom died just before her 2nd birthday. In spite of his unscrupulous business practices, Bill Rockefeller achieved a level of respectability for a time during the 1840s in the town of Moravia and helped finance the foundation of the local school. At the same time, he considered farm work beneath his dignity, and the 2 elder boys, John and William Jr., were soon required to do much of the manual labor around the Rockefeller home. The boys were given adult responsibilities at a young age, something which was hardly unusual in the 19th century, an era when children as young as 9 or 10 years old were often expected to contribute to the household finances by finding work of some kind. This caused John and William Jr. to mature quickly. John attended the school established by his father. Although he was not exceptionally bright, he had a natural aptitude for mental arithmetic. He was otherwise a quiet, introverted boy who lacked the exuberance of his peers. But he was patient. When playing chess or checkers, he would take his time considering every move, an approach which frustrated his opponents and caused them to lose. This habit of cool reflection was encouraged by his mother, who had much time and cause over the years to reflect on her impulsive decision to marry the erratic and errant Bill Rockefeller. John also owed his strong sense of faith to his mother, who took her children to the local Baptist church. The 1840s was a time of economic and territorial expansion in the United States, and John D. Rockefeller exhibited an entrepreneurial spirit characteristic of the era from a very early age. As a boy, he bought candy from the store by the pound, divided it into smaller portions, and sold it to his siblings at a profit. At the age of 7, he came upon a nest of turkey chicks in the woods and raised them at home for sale. John's childhood desire to make money owed much to Bill's influence. Although he would come to recognize his father's numerous character flaws, as a child, John lionized his father as a strong, athletic man who took his children hunting and fishing and entertained them at home by singing songs and playing the violin. While the family experienced long periods of anxiety while Bill was away, he would return with generous gifts and large amounts of cash earned by both fair and foul means. Among Bill's more legitimate enterprises was a lumber business in Moravia. And when John was 8 or 9, he was taught how to select good quality wood for the family house. As a businessman, Bill negotiated aggressively and did not hesitate to take advantage of the ignorance of potential customers. At the same time, he generally offered generous wages to his workers, paid his debts on time, and carried out his contractual responsibilities. John's own business practices later in life would closely resemble his father's. He would avoid the controversies that dogged his father, though. After being indicted for sexual assault in 1849, Bill Rockefeller left Moravia, and in spring 1850, the family moved to Owego, near the Pennsylvania border. It may have been around this time that John stopped idolizing his father and recognized him for who he was. He soon began referring to his mother as a widow, and in adult life, he avoided talking about his father. In August 1852, John and his brother William enrolled in the prestigious Owego Academy. But after a few months, Bill took the family further west to Strongsville, Ohio. In the autumn of 1853, the Rockefeller boys resumed their education at the higher school in nearby Cleveland. As American settlers moved towards the Pacific, encouraged by discoveries of gold in California, the country was sharply divided on the question of slavery. In his school essays, Rockefeller expressed himself as an ardent abolitionist, a cause championed by the newly founded Republican Party. John was close friends with Mark Hanna, who would later become a powerful Republican Party boss and senator for New York. John hoped to go to university, but in May 1855, on the eve of his graduation, his father abruptly asked him to drop out of school and find a job. The unwelcome news was connected to the double life that Bill Rockefeller was now living. For several years, he had taken his traveling doctorate across the frontier into Canada. And in 1852, he met and fell in love with 17-year-old Margaret Allen from Ontario. While courting the teenager, Bill conveniently neglected to mention the presence of his wife and 5 children south of the border. And in June 1855, William Rockefeller contracted a bigamous marriage with Allen. William realized that he did not have the financial means to maintain two families and encouraged his eldest son to find work. After taking a 3-month course at a commercial college, John began looking for employment in August. He made a list of all the businesses he wanted to work for and visited them in person to ask if they needed a bookkeeper. After several weeks, he had no luck, and his father suggested that he could always join him roaming the country. The appalling prospect of doing so galvanized John to continue searching, and on the 26th of September, 1855, the small merchant firm Hewitt and Tuttle hired him as an assistant bookkeeper. For the rest of his life, he would celebrate 26th of September as Job Day. The teenager loved the job and examined each bill and invoice in detail, accounting for every single cent to ensure that his employers avoided being swindled by their clients. He arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m. in the morning and often did not return home until after 10 p.m. at night. Upon starting work at Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller began keeping track of his personal income and expenditures in a red notebook he christened Ledger A. The book shows that as soon as he started earning money, Rockefeller was making donations to charitable causes. By 1859, he was giving away 10% of his income, and while he favored Baptist causes, he also gave money to black churches and helped 2 African-American slaves buy their freedom. He taught at Sunday school at the Erie Street Baptist Church in Cleveland and led the congregation in singing hymns. He also used his financial acumen to save the church by raising $2,000 from the congregation to pay off a demanding creditor. Rockefeller found no contradiction between his faith and his desire for money, and as a rich man, he would credit God for making him wealthy. Despite an economic downturn in 1857, Bill Rockefeller was making good money too and decided to build a large house in downtown Cleveland to bring his first family under a single roof for the first time in several years. While Bill funded the project, John was left in charge of supervising it and paying the contractors. John's success in managing the project seems to have convinced Bill that he was now capable of being head of the family, and Bill went to live permanently with his second wife in Philadelphia. Although he would occasionally reappear in John's life over the decades, there is an irony to the fact that the rapacious father detached himself from his first family just as his son was embarking on a journey that would make him the richest man in the world. Had he known how much money John would soon make, Bill would doubtlessly have hung around to try and fleece some of it. In January 1857, after junior partner Henry Tuttle left the firm, Rockefeller was promoted to chief bookkeeper on $500 a year, considerably below Tuttle's salary of $2,000. After being given a modest increase to $600, he began trading commodities on his own account. As the pay dispute dragged on, Rockefeller and his English friend, Maurice B. Clark, formed their own trading house in April 1858, with each partner investing $2,000 of capital in the business. Rockefeller managed to save half the sum, but was forced to take a loan of $1,000 from his father at 10% for the rest. The partnership proved a profitable venture, netting $4,400 in its first year and $17,000 in its second. However, the volatility of the commodities trade and the need for cash flow to pay suppliers compelled Rockefeller to seek more loans from his father, who often recalled the debt at inopportune moments. Rockefeller's habit of making risky deals which paid off handsomely set him at odds with the more conservative Clark. In April 1859, the firm shored up its capital by bringing in George Gardner, a former colleague of Clark's who hailed from one of the leading families in Cleveland and would later serve as its mayor. Rockefeller felt understandably slighted when Clark unilaterally changed the name of the firm to Clark, Gardner and Company. He was also irritated when Gardner bought a yacht with 3 friends and invited him on a sailing excursion one Saturday afternoon. Rockefeller believed that such indulgences would undermine the firm's ability to access credit. Eventually, though, Gardner withdrew from the partnership in late 1862, and the firm reverted to Clark and Rockefeller. Rockefeller's timing was opportune to begin setting out on a business career, as the United States of America was about to embark on a period of immense expansion and economic growth. Firstly, the country was expanding swiftly. With the end of the Mexican-American War and the inception of the California Gold Rush in 1848, having led to the opening of the American West. Mass migration of millions of people from Europe, where overpopulation was a growing problem, on the new steamships from the 1840s onwards, also created a population boom in America. The U.S. population in 1850 was around 23 million people. It reached 50 million around 1880, 75 million around the turn of the century, and would reach 100 million for the first time in the mid-1910s. This huge explosion in the domestic labor market and the market for domestic production facilitated the emergence of new businesses and tycoons. On top of this, the U.S. was just beginning to enter into a period of more pronounced industrialization as Rockefeller began his business career. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Britain in the 1770s and had belatedly spread elsewhere in the first half of the 19th century. It really took off in many other countries, most especially the US and Germany, in the second half of the 19th century. All of these developments, the population boom, the expansion of the country to the Pacific Ocean, and mass industrialization, would see the United States emerge as the world's largest domestic economy by the end of the 19th century. Although Britain was still larger when its colonial empire was taken into account. Finally, two other factors would play into Rockefeller's hands. There was a railway boom beginning to connect America from coast to coast in the 1850s and 1860s. And there was also a growing awareness that new types of fossil fuel besides heavy coal could be used to fuel the American economy. Like all individuals who become enormously successful in business, Rockefeller worked hard and took the opportunities presented to him. But his timing was also very fortuitous and would contribute substantially to his success. In November 1860, the 21-year-old Rockefeller voted in a presidential election for the first time and cast his ballot for Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate. With the Democratic Party split between Northern and Southern factions, Lincoln won the election by carrying the Northern anti-slavery states. Lincoln's opposition to the expansion of slavery encouraged Southern states to secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America, leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War in April 1861. Although Rockefeller later claimed that he wanted to serve the Union cause, he decided to continue in business to provide for his family. While John and William avoided military service by paying $300 each for a substitute, their youngest brother Frank enlisted in the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry and was wounded twice. The disruption to North-South trade during the war benefited the East-West trade via Cleveland and Rockefeller, and his business partners profited handsomely. With the profits from his commodity trading partnership, Rockefeller now entered the nascent oil industry. During the 1850s, America's booming economy created a demand for lighting that was outstripping the dwindling supply of whale oil. While passing through western Pennsylvania in 1853, the New York lawyer George Bissell saw indigenous Seneca people use black rock oil for medicinal purposes. The following year, he formed a company and commissioned distinguished Yale scientist Dr. Benjamin Silliman to investigate the feasibility of using rock oil for both lighting and lubrication. Silliman's research confirmed the potential of rock oil or petroleum. But Bissell and the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company still required a method of extracting oil at scale. In 1856, Bissell alighted upon the idea of drilling for oil, inspired by brine wells used for salt extraction. He dispatched Edwin Drake to Pennsylvania, and after several false starts, Drake struck oil near Titusville in August 1859. It did not take long for the area to be teeming with men seeking to make their fortune. In the meantime, a Canadian geologist, Abraham Gessner, had developed a method of producing lamp fuel which he called kerosene using petroleum. As the oil boom began, in Cleveland, Clark and Rockefeller began handling small shipments of crude oil in 1860. When Clark's friend Samuel Andrews approached the two men seeking capital for an oil refinery, Rockefeller was enthusiastic about the prospect, while Clark was more skeptical. In 1863, Andrews, Clark, and Rockefeller joined two of Clark's brothers in forming Andrews, Clark & Co. The company set up its operations under the name Excelsior Oil Works on a site more than a mile away from downtown Cleveland, but adjacent to the railroad connecting Cleveland to the Pennsylvania oil fields, which opened in November 1863. Although Clark and Rockefeller initially regarded oil as a sideline to their commodity business, the refinery was already more profitable than the rest of the business in its first year. Rockefeller's improving financial prospects encouraged him to get married to Laura Celestia Spellman, whom he first met at Cleveland High School more than a decade earlier. An intelligent woman with a commercial mind of her own, Laura came from one of Cleveland's wealthier families. Rockefeller did not begin actively courting her until 1862, when she was working as a teacher. Neither was in a hurry to marry, and Rockefeller did not propose until March 1864. Following the wedding in September 1864, the couple spent a month on honeymoon, taking in such sights as Niagara Falls, Quebec, and New York City. They moved into a small house a couple of doors away from the Rockefeller family home. After 2 years of marriage, Laura gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth in August 1866. A second daughter, Alice, followed in 1869, but died just after her first birthday. The family would welcome 2 more daughters in 1871 and 1872, but it was not until 1874 that the couple had their only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who would inherit his father's fortune many, many years later. Although several oil refineries had sprung up in Cleveland, Rockefeller's was one of the few which was sufficiently capitalized to weather extreme market volatility. While others saw oil as the latest get-rich-quick scheme, Rockefeller retained a long-term perspective and proposed borrowing heavily to finance rapid expansion, believing the oil market would get bigger and bigger over time. When the cautious Clark brothers used their majority to vote down his proposals, Rockefeller prepared to break from the Clarks and secured Andrews' support. When Rockefeller laid out plans for a rapid expansion of the business in January 1865, the Clarks threatened to dissolve the partnership. To their surprise, Rockefeller agreed, and the two parties agreed to hold an auction for the company. Rockefeller had been talking to several bankers and was confident that he could outbid his rivals. The bidding started at $500 and quickly reached $60,000 before inching up to $70,000. Rockefeller was beginning to doubt whether he could afford the deal, but after Clark bid $72,000, he immediately responded with $72,500, and Clark decided he could go no higher. That $500 was the making of John D. Rockefeller. On the 15th of February, 1865, the new Rockefeller and Andrews partnership took over operations at the Excelsior refinery. Rockefeller was the senior partner and was responsible for the management of the business, leaving scientific and technical details to Andrews. A few weeks later, the American Civil War came to an end, with General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on 12th April. The jubilation in Cleveland was cut short by President Lincoln's assassination on the 15th, though the return of peacetime conditions would benefit the emerging oil industry. The end of the Civil War meant not only the triumph of freedom over slavery, but of industrial capitalism over agrarianism. as the war had very much been a clash between an urban, industrial union in the northern states and a rural, agricultural confederacy in the South. Ohio Congressman and future President James Garfield prophetically remarked, "Oil, not cotton, is king now in the world of commerce." Despite its potential, the industry was still in its infancy. Accidents and explosions were common, and fortunes were lost as often as they were made. In December 1865, Rockefeller established a second refinery in Cleveland known as the Standard Works and placed his brother William in charge. The enterprise was the largest and most profitable of the refiners in Cleveland, and the company boosted its profitability by selling a wide range of byproducts. By having its own barrel-making plants, shipping facilities, and railroad cars, the company had greater control over expenses. American oil quickly made its way onto the international market, and in 1866, William Rockefeller established an office in New York City to build relationships with Wall Street bankers and manage the firm's exports. Although Rockefeller borrowed heavily during his early days, he earned the trust of bankers by paying his debts on time, enabling him to access credit in emergencies and survive crises that would bankrupt his rivals. To pursue his expansion plans, in 1867, Rockefeller brought in Henry Flagler and expanded the partnership to become Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. 9 years older than Rockefeller, Flagler had also been born in upstate New York before moving to Ohio. The two men were first acquainted in the 1850s, when Flagler was working as a grain merchant, and Rockefeller served as his agent at Hewitt & Tuttle. As part of the deal, Flagler's stepbrother Stephen Harkness, one of the richest men in Cleveland, contributed $100,000 in capital for a third of the business. Rockefeller and Flagler had their desks opposite each other and worked seamlessly together. The two men developed a habit of editing each other's letters, which would pass through the critical eyes of Laura Rockefeller for a third opinion before being dispatched. Not long after joining the partnership, Flagler was placed in charge of the firm's negotiations with the railroads. Transportation was one of the most significant costs in the refining business, and Rockefeller benefited from being close to the oil fields. Rockefeller's Cleveland location allowed him to transport his oil by water via Lake Erie or by the 3 railroads that ran through the city, allowing him to negotiate the best freight rates. The railroads were also in stiff competition with each other. The Pennsylvania Railroad was encouraging firms to move to the oil regions by offering low rates to undermine the Erie and New York Central Railroads, which depended on Cleveland traffic. Jay Gould of the Erie Railroad offered Rockefeller a 75% rebate on transportation costs, while Flagler secured a major discount with the Lake Shore Railroad, part of the New York Central Network. In return, Flagler offered to supply 60 carloads a day, a significant commitment which the Rockefeller refineries could not fulfill on their own. Accordingly, Rockefeller used his position in the market to coordinate shipments from rival Cleveland firms at preferential rates. In a measure of the railroad's eagerness to seal the deal, when Rockefeller said that he did not have time to meet Cornelius Vanderbilt, the 74-year-old owner of the New York Central and the richest man in the country at the time, Vanderbilt visited the 29-year-old Rockefeller at his office instead. The Lake Shore deal had major consequences for the oil industry, since it enabled Rockefeller to consolidate his leading position in the market. By 1869, the Rockefeller Partnership was the world's largest refiner, employing 900 workers who produced 2,500 barrels a day, accounting for 10% of global output at that time. Not long after the Lake Shore deal, John and Laura Rockefeller moved to a brick house on 424 Euclid Avenue, nicknamed Millionaire's Row owing to the large mansions that lined its streets, many of them owned by newly rich figures from the oil and rail industries. The Rockefeller house itself was relatively modest, since John was not inclined to show off his wealth and disliked ostentatious displays of it throughout much of his life. Notably, in this regard, The later decision to establish the Rockefeller Center in downtown Manhattan as a highly visible symbol of the family's wealth and power was not driven by him and was the vision of his son and heir in the 1930s, John Jr. At their new home in Euclid Avenue, religion continued to play a major part in the family's life, and John and Laura avoided going to the theater and the opera. Instead, the 4 surviving children were encouraged to take up musical instruments and formed a quartet which performed regularly at church, which relocated to Euclid Avenue on Rockefeller's initiative in 1872. Although John D. Rockefeller took a greater interest in his children's upbringing than his peers, they were primarily brought up by governesses and only had the opportunity to engage with wider society at church. The children were taught to be self-sufficient and had no sense of their father's ever-increasing wealth. Instead, Rockefeller taught his children to keep detailed accounts of the income they received for doing tasks around the house. While Rockefeller had become a market leader in the refinery business, the lure of black gold had attracted so many players that by 1870, supply was 3 times that of demand, causing the price of kerosene to plummet, eradicating profit margins for many refiners. Rockefeller believed that the market was unsustainable and the industry was being ruined by excess competition. As he set out to bring order out of the chaos of the American oil industry, he envisaged the industry as a large network of interrelated companies that would benefit from economies of scale to reduce costs and control the supply and price of oil. Such an arrangement allowed customers to benefit from lower prices while ensuring that the industry remained profitable. He required substantial capital to realize his vision, and Flagler suggested incorporating the company to access outside investment. In January 1870, Rockefeller dissolved the existing partnership and incorporated the firm as the Standard Oil Company, with himself as president, William as vice president, and Flagler as secretary and treasurer. Rockefeller was the largest shareholder with a 29% stake, while other company insiders had no more than 15%. The company had its first outside investor in William's brother-in-law, Oliver B. Jennings, who made a fortune in the California gold rush and invested $100,000 for a 10% stake. The senior executives aligned their incentives with investors by refusing a salary, and instead relied on dividend payments and share price appreciation. Although 1870 was one of the toughest years in the oil industry up to that time, Standard could pay a 105% dividend at the end of its first year. When prices continued to decline in 1871, leaving many competitors on the brink of bankruptcy, Standard was still profitable enough to pay a 40% dividend. Anticipating further turbulence in the market, in January 1872, Standard Oil raised another $2.5 million on top of its initial capital of $1 million to strengthen its balance sheet. With his massive war chest, Rockefeller was ready to bring the rival Cleveland refineries into the Standard Oil family. While Rockefeller was preparing to consolidate the oil industry, fierce competition among the railroads was having a detrimental effect on all parties. Late in 1871, Rockefeller was approached about an alliance with the Pennsylvania, Erie, and New York Central Railroads. They agreed to double freight prices overnight while offering generous rebates to a select number of refineries in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, who would form the deceptively named South Improvement Company. Standard Oil was to serve as an impartial umpire to guarantee agreed quotas of traffic between the 3 lines. 45% on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the remainder evenly divided between the 2 others. Before the proposal could be implemented, though, news of the higher rates leaked out in February 1872, leading to strikes among oil producers and causing significant disruption to Standard Oil's operations. Rockefeller responded by trying to acquire a greater share of the market than ever before, one which would allow him to circumnavigate these problems. In the 3 months between December 1871 and March 1872, Standard carried out the so-called Cleveland Massacre by buying out 22 of its 26 rivals in Cleveland. Rockefeller began by targeting his strongest rivals, knowing that it would have a major psychological impact on the weaker ones. The main competitor was Clark and Payne, whose largest shareholder, Colonel Oliver Payne, was a Civil War veteran whom Rockefeller had known at high school. When Payne asked to see Standard's accounts, he was bewildered by its profitability and agreed to sell. He soon became a valued member of the Standard Oil organization and shared an office with Rockefeller and Flagler. Rockefeller's involvement in the South Improvement Company and his aggressive consolidation of the oil industry caused him to be vilified in the press by critics who argued that he was forcing all of his rivals out of existence and buying up their assets at a fraction of their true value. In many cases, he bought refineries which he considered antiquated and inefficient simply to shut them down and limit market supply. Following the Cleveland Massacre, Standard had the capacity to refine 10,000 barrels a day, a quarter of the world's output at the time. Many of Rockefeller's rivals were forced to sell their mansions on Euclid Avenue and nursed a bitter resentment against him for the rest of their days. Rockefeller later justified his actions by resorting to religious imagery, claiming that he was a savior who was offering his competitors a chance to get onto the Standard Oil ark before the flood swept them all out of business. Rockefeller also believed that his measures to stabilize the market would give industrial workers greater job security, rather than hiring and firing them in accordance with the boom and bust cycle. Standard's economies of scale enabled Rockefeller to pay his workers more than the industry average. During Standard's early years, he personally interviewed all job applicants and knew all his employees by name. Nevertheless, the accusation emerged in the 1870s that Rockefeller was bent on acquiring a monopoly over the oil industry in the United States and was abusing his market position. It was an issue which dogged him for half a century and would eventually result in the breaking up of Standard Oil decades later. Despite his victory in Cleveland, the railroad's undertaking to implement uniform rates placed Standard at a disadvantage compared to the refiners in the oil regions out further west. In response, Rockefeller entered into an alliance with the Pittsburgh refiners in May 1872 and formed the National Refiners Association, an arrangement popularly known as the Pittsburgh Plan. The association would collectively negotiate lower prices with the railroads and guarantee profits for smaller refiners in return for production caps. When Rockefeller struggled to convince the Western refiners to sign up, he reached out to firms in New York and Philadelphia. He was soon irritated by smaller refiners exceeding their production quotas, forcing Standard to reduce its own output, while other firms, which remained outside the cartel, enjoyed higher prices without being subject to any quotas. In December, he came to an agreement with producers to buy oil at $5 a barrel, double the market price, in exchange for production quotas. Enticed by the higher prices, the oil producers exceeded their quotas and drove prices down to $2. Frustrated by widespread violations of the agreements, Rockefeller abandoned the Pittsburgh Plan in June 1873 and believed that the only way he could stabilize the market was to take full control. Events soon moved in his favor when an economic crisis known as the Panic of 1873 caused a 6-year depression, during which crude oil prices plummeted to under 50 cents a barrel. Rockefeller was in prime position to take advantage, as Standard Oil still remained profitable, despite only operating 2 of its 6 large refineries in Cleveland. Following the failure of the Pittsburgh Plan, Rockefeller set his sights on the Pittsburgh and Philadelphia refineries. Adopting the same playbook as in Cleveland, in autumn 1874, Rockefeller and Flagler met with Charles Lockhart and William G. Worden, the proprietors of the leading refineries in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, respectively. After 6 hours of inconclusive talks, Rockefeller invited Worden to Cleveland to examine Standard's books. Once Worden realized that Standard could sell kerosene for a profit at a price below his operating costs, he and Lockhart agreed to join forces with Rockefeller. The deal sent shockwaves through the system, and within 2 years, only a single independent refinery remained in Pittsburgh out of the 22 that previously existed. Likewise, Rockefeller expanded his footprint in New York by acquiring Charles Pratt and Company. The deal was kept secret, an arrangement that Rockefeller preferred with many smaller refiners, since he recognized that it was better to give the impression of a competitive market to avoid a political backlash. In the mid-1870s, he continued to acquire refineries. In the process, many former critics became Standard converts. The most prominent was the 27-year-old John D. Archbold, who had been one of the most vociferous opponents of the South Improvement Company scheme. Archbold became a senior figure at Standard Oil and represented Rockefeller in negotiations with producers. In September 1875, the Acme Oil Company was founded with Archbold as its president to serve as a front for Standard's acquisition of refineries, while Rockefeller controlled all the oil headed to New York. A few remaining independents in West Virginia could transport their oil to Baltimore via the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. In May 1875, Rockefeller acquired J.N. Camden and Company in secret, and then used Camden as his vehicle to buy up the refineries in West Virginia. In his mid-30s, John D. Rockefeller was master of the American oil industry, which effectively meant the global oil industry. While he owed much of his success to his close relationship with the Erie and New York Central Railroads, he was often in conflict with the Pennsylvania Railroad. When the Pennsylvania set up the Empire Transportation Company to acquire oil pipelines in 1873, Rockefeller responded by building his own pipeline network. With Rockefeller tightening his grip on the market, Empire began to acquire its own refineries. And in 1877, the Pennsylvania took advantage of a dispute between Rockefeller and producers exploiting a new oil field in Bradford, Pennsylvania, to connect the new wells to its own pipelines. Rockefeller fought back by diverting oil to the Erie and New York Central, forcing the Pennsylvania to fire hundreds of workers and triggering a strike. The Pennsylvania's president, Tom Scott, backed down and offered to sell all of the Empire Transportation Company's assets to Standard Oil for $3.4 million, including a fleet of obsolete steamships which Rockefeller had to pay for out of his own pocket because his fellow executives refused to authorize the full amount. Rockefeller was magnanimous in victory and worked out a revenue-sharing plan that restored Pennsylvania's market-leading position. Standard continued to expand its pipeline network, and by 1879, it controlled almost the entire pipeline system in the country, in addition to 90% of refining capacity. When Titusville producer Byron Benson formed the Tidewater Pipeline Company to build an 100-mile-long pipeline to Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Standard scrambled to buy up tracts of land to block the way, while company officials bribed legislators to vote down pipeline bills. Despite these efforts, the Tidewater Pipeline was completed in May 1879. The acceleration of American economic activity and innovation around this time facilitated the enormous enrichment of Rockefeller and Standard Oil. The railway boom was reaching its peak in the late 1870s and into the 1880s. The ever-growing population and the rising consumer classes meant that production and consumption were constantly expanding, and oil was needed for a wide range of industrial activities. Still, there were challenges as well. In September 1882, Thomas Edison began the electrification of America when he switched on the Pearl Street station in Manhattan. While we might think that this would have been a boon to petroleum companies, the American electricity grid was fueled by coal for decades to come, well into the 20th century, not petroleum. Conversely, electrification saw a sharp decline in the need for oil for lamp lighting in homes. Yet this was more than offset by the increasing demand for Standard Oil's product in other areas of the economy and society. In the 1890s, for instance, there were rapid advances in the development of automobiles, and in the 1900s, Ford's Model T would appear, fueled by petroleum. Ships, which were huge fuel guzzlers, would soon be switching over to petroleum from coal as well. The scale of demand was mirrored in the size of crude oil production in the U.S. during this period. Around 1870, there were less than 5 million barrels of oil being produced in the United States every year. By the end of the century, that figure had increased 12-fold to nearly 60 million, and it then nearly doubled by the mid-1900s as new wells in Oklahoma and Texas came on stream. Standard Oil would play a role in all of this, and it would soon see John D. Rockefeller becoming the world's richest man and first billionaire. Much of that lay in the future. Back in the early 1880s, the setback over the Tidewater pipeline was a sign that Rockefeller's opponents were gaining strength. More worryingly, he and 8 colleagues were indicted by the Pennsylvania state government for monopolizing the oil business. Rockefeller was sufficiently alarmed by these developments that he announced an end to the railroad rebates, and the cases against Standard Oil were dropped. This coincided with a finding by the Hepburn Committee of the New York State Assembly that rebates were unlawful. However, the intervention came too late, as Standard Oil had already exploited them to achieve its dominant position in the market. Having lost his advantages from the railroads, Rockefeller was even more determined to face down Tidewater. Rockefeller soon discovered that Byron Benson also preferred cooperation to competition, and the two parties entered into an agreement. In 1882, Rockefeller's associates acquired a minority stake in Tidewater, enabling him to strike a favorable market-sharing agreement the following year. Now in his 40s, Rockefeller was among the richest men in the country and was an increasingly notorious individual. In one of his rare interviews, he argued that with a business as large as Standard Oil, it was inevitable for malpractice to occur without the knowledge of senior management, but that he would intervene as soon as he became aware of the issue. While Rockefeller often acted through subordinates to cover his tracks, it was true that his sprawling business empire was becoming difficult to control. Many states forbade companies from owning subsidiaries across state lines, so the Standard Oil empire consisted of 41 separate companies. In 1882, to solve some of these issues, the company's lawyers came up with the innovative solution of creating the Standard Oil Trust, where 9 trustees, including Rockefeller, were appointed to manage the interests of the company's 37 stockholders. Although the arrangement did not become public until 6 years later, the creation of the Standard Oil Trust was a major innovation in American corporate history, and companies in other industries soon followed suit until the word trust became synonymous with monopoly power. The consolidation of the industry also brought Standard's center of gravity further east, and in early 1884, Rockefeller moved his family to New York City. Then May 1885, company headquarters was formally transferred from Cleveland to a new 10-story office at 26 Broadway in Manhattan. Despite moving to the country's economic capital, Rockefeller continued to keep a low profile and limited his social activities to the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. As his fame and notoriety increased, he was flooded with correspondence asking for charitable donations. While Rockefeller was concerned about poverty in cities, he did not want to encourage dependency and was keen to ensure value for money for his contributions. In addition to Baptist causes, he favored donating to educational institutions, supporting schools for women, African Americans, and Native Americans. In 1882, Rockefeller began supporting a black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia, which was named Spelman Seminary. Later Spelman College, in honor of his in-laws who donated alongside him. Rockefeller sought to encourage others to contribute to his favored causes by offering matching donations. In 1889, he offered $600,000 for the establishment of the University of Chicago, which was founded in 1892. And he continued to give liberally to the institution throughout the remainder of his life. This was in keeping with other major American titans of industry in the Gilded Age, such as the Vanderbilts and Andrew Carnegie, who were some of the great philanthropists of modern history. Endowing universities, making large charitable bequests, and establishing great civic buildings like Carnegie Hall in New York City. Throughout his career, Rockefeller worked hard and kept an obsessive eye on the smallest fluctuations in the oil market. By delegating operational authority to an executive committee, which he rarely attended, Rockefeller freed up more time to travel. In June 1887, he made his first trip overseas, taking a 3-month holiday with his family in Europe. In London, the family stayed at a hotel in Piccadilly and were in prime position to witness Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee Parade. Next up was Paris. Although the family spent much of the trip visiting churches and admiring the natural scenery, Rockefeller realized to some discomfort that he was internationally famous, and his arrival in every city was publicized in local newspapers. He reluctantly agreed to an audience with Pope Leo III after being advised that it would please Standard's Catholic employees. During his travels in Europe, Rockefeller had an opportunity to observe his international competitors up close. During the 1870s, oil was discovered near the Russian port of Baku on the Caspian Sea, now the capital of Azerbaijan. By the 1880s, the Russian market had been cornered by the Swedish businessman Robert Nobel and his brothers, including Alfred, the inventor of dynamite and the founder of the Nobel Prizes. In the meantime, the Parisian branch of the Rothschild family set up the Caspian and Black Sea Oil Company and built refineries on the eastern shore of the Adriatic to refine crude oil from Baku. In 1890, Royal Dutch was founded in the Dutch East Indies to exploit oil fields in present-day Indonesia. And the following year, the London merchant Marcus Samuel set up what would become the Shell Transport and Trading Company, which merged with Royal Dutch in 1907 to form a rival business empire that dominated the Asian market. Rockefeller responded to these developments by establishing Standard's own marketing offices in Europe. Despite increasing foreign competition, even in an age before the Middle East became a major player in the world oil market, Standard's control of the domestic market in the United States remained seemingly unassailable. Owing to its control of pipelines, in the early 1880s, Standard revolutionized distribution by storing refined oil in large tanks, where the company's large fleet of tank wagons would fill up before selling to customers. Rockefeller realized that he could control oil prices by changing oil storage costs depending on market conditions. Standard issued certificates against the oil in its pipelines, which could be bought and sold, thereby creating the oil futures market. However, Rockefeller bemoaned the pricing power of speculators buying and selling oil futures. Standard rapidly expanded its marketing division to control local markets, and Standard officials resorted to aggressive sales tactics by reducing prices to drive competitors out of the market. Rockefeller answered critics by merely stating that the company wanted to supply cheap oil to poor Americans. He also defended the company's profitability by arguing that the oil fields could run dry, leaving Standard saddled with worthless assets, or that the demand for oil might collapse. These anxieties were not entirely misplaced, and Edison's electrification project in the early 1880s threatened sales of illumination oil, though Rockefeller's interests in natural gas allowed him to take advantage of the shift towards gaslighting. In 1892, the 53-year-old John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world, following the death of railroad tycoon Jay Gould. With around $100 million to his name, Rockefeller became the primary target of criticism from journalists and political reformers who contrasted the wealth of industrial capitalists like Rockefeller with industrial workers who lived close to poverty. From the late 1870s, the journalist Henry Demarest Lloyd began publishing articles claiming that Standard Oil owed its oil monopoly to its secret agreements with the railroads. Lloyd's sources included both independent refiners whom Standard had bought out or crushed and former Standard men with a guilty conscience. In 1887, Congress set up the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate standardized freight rates. This had little impact on Standard, which by then transported most of its oil through its pipelines. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to outlaw monopolistic behavior. And in 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil of Ohio must leave the trust. Rockefeller continued to manage the business as a consolidated entity by transforming Standard Oil of New Jersey, chartered under New Jersey laws but registered at 26 Broadway, into a holding company. In 1893, Rockefeller clashed with steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie, who was troubled by Rockefeller's investments in iron ore. The dispute was easy fodder for newspaper cartoonists, but Carnegie soon made a deal with Rockefeller to buy his ore in exchange for a promise not to make steel. The same year, Rockefeller bought the estate of Pocantico Hills some 20 miles north of New York City. Pocantico became a retreat for Rockefeller as he stepped back from his business. His mother had died in March 1889, though his elusive father continued to live until 1906. Rockefeller had his own health issues and suffered from alopecia, a rare disease that caused hair loss, depriving him of his iconic bushy mustache. By mid-1897, he left John Dustin Archbold in charge at Standard Oil, while retaining his title of president and his 30% stake. He relied on his son John Jr. to keep him informed of Standard's business operations in his capacity as vice president. In 1899, Rockefeller took up golf and built golf courses at his estates in New York and Cleveland. In 1896, Rockefeller donated to Republican candidate William McKinley's presidential campaign, which was managed by his school friend Mark Hanna. McKinley defeated the progressive Democrat William Jennings Bryan in the general election, and Rockefeller's interests appeared to be secure. He devoted more time to philanthropic activities, and in 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, now Rockefeller University. He formed trusts for charitable purposes, enabling donors to pool their assets so they could be invested more efficiently. In the meantime, McKinley won re-election in 1900, but was assassinated by an anarchist the following year and was succeeded by his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt. Hailing from the progressive wing of the Republican Party, Roosevelt filed dozens of suits against monopolies through the Department of Justice under the Sherman Antitrust Act and gained a reputation for trust-busting. Pro-business Republicans rallied around Mark Hanna to challenge the president in the 1904 election. But after the New York senator's death in February, business leaders reluctantly supported Roosevelt's re-election campaign. Rockefeller was also facing a new wave of criticism in the press after the journalist Ida Tarbell published a lengthy expose of Standard Oil for McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904. Tarbell had grown up in Titusville, where her father operated production and refining facilities, and believed that Standard had destroyed his business. She highlighted Standard's industrial espionage, price manipulation, and secretive ownership structures. While Rockefeller refused to address Tarbell's accusations in public, in private, he was infuriated when the media began to dig up details of his father's shady past. John had known about his father's bigamous marriage since the 1880s, but it became public knowledge following a press investigation in 1908. while Standard fought back by sponsoring the publication of favorable books and articles, and Rockefeller sought to protect his reputation by inviting reporters to his golf courses. Standard was facing an increasing number of lawsuits from federal and state governments, and Rockefeller often tried to avoid being served court papers. In a high-profile case from 1907, federal judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis fined Standard over $29 million in relation to railroad rebates. Standard appealed and the judgment was overturned the following year. In 1908, Rockefeller supported the Ohio Republican William Howard Taft to succeed Roosevelt as president. While Taft was temperamentally more conservative, he not only continued Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign, but expanded it. Although New Jersey had changed its laws to formalize Standard's holding company structure in 1909, a circuit court ordered the company to break up for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Although Standard appealed the decision through the federal court system, in May 1911, the Supreme Court dismissed the final appeal and gave the trust 6 months to disband. By the time of the breakup, Standard controlled 14% of the crude oil supply and 70% of the refined oil market. Rockefeller formally stood down as president of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which remained the largest single entity held by the Rockefeller family. Standard's shareholders received a corresponding stake in the 34 independent companies that emerged from the dissolution of the monopoly, including entities that would become Conoco, Chevron, Exxon, and Mobil. The breakup gave the American public the opportunity to buy Standard shares for the first time, sending the stock skyrocketing, thus making Rockefeller the world's first billionaire by 1916. Flush with cash, Rockefeller proposed the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was chartered by New York in 1913. Rockefeller contributed a total of $183 million to the foundation, which focused primarily on health and supported medical schools all over the world. Over time, Rockefeller gave away most of his wealth to his children, particularly John Jr., who had already been helping his father manage his investments and served as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. The younger Rockefeller had resigned from Standard's board in 1910 in the midst of a bribery scandal involving Archbold, and devoted most of his time to philanthropic activities. However, John Jr. was responsible for one of the family's darkest moments in his capacity as director of Colorado Fuel and Iron, in which his father held a controlling share. When the United Mine Workers went on strike against poor working conditions in 1913, Jr. supported the company's efforts to break the strike. In April 1914, Colorado National Guardsmen and private guards hired by the company attacked the strikers, killing over 20 men, women, and children. While Jr.'s actions against the strikers received the wholehearted support of his father, the former recognized the damage to the family's public image and used Rockefeller Foundation funds to support the miners' families. In September 1914, John and Laura Rockefeller celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at Pocantico. But Laura had been in poor health and died the following spring. The widower endowed the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Foundation with $74 million to support religious and educational causes, and the organization later merged with the Rockefeller Foundation. After the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Rockefeller's image improved as he bought war bonds and supported Allied causes via the philanthropic foundation. He noted the irony of governments around the world encouraging oil firms to work together to supply fuel for military vehicles. In 1918, Rockefeller bought a winter home called The Casements at Ormond Beach in Florida. The house lay across the street from the Ormond Hotel, developed by his former business partner, Henry Flagler, who moved to Florida in the 1880s and died in 1913. The two men had fallen out after Flagler divorced his second wife to marry a much younger woman, and Rockefeller only began to visit the area after Flagler's death. For the remaining 2 decades of his life, Rockefeller remained passionate about social and religious causes. He was pleased to see the prohibition of alcohol in 1920 with the passage of the 18th Amendment. However, after a thriving black market developed in its wake, Rockefeller did not object to its repeal in 1933, realizing that prohibition had created more problems than it solved. In retirement, Rockefeller continued to make investments in the stock market and lost nearly half of his remaining wealth during the Wall Street crash of October and November 1929. Having experienced his fair share of market cycles, he was undeterred and acquired 1 million shares of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which was experiencing a renewed wave of expansion under its third president, Walter Clark Teagle. Coincidentally, the grandson of Rockefeller's first business partner, Maurice Clark. Meanwhile, John Jr. helped to revive New York City's economic fortunes by financing the construction of the Rockefeller Center, one of the largest commercial complexes in the world. Despite his reputation for secrecy and reserve as a businessman, Rockefeller was a jovial old man in his 80s and 90s and maintained the wish that he would live to 100. He would fall just short of his target, dying early in the morning of the 23rd of May, 1937, a few weeks short of his 98th birthday. His body was taken by train from the Casements for a funeral in Pocantico, during which all the old Standard companies around the world stopped working to observe a 5-minute silence. Following the funeral, his remains were transferred to Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, where he was laid to rest alongside his mother and wife. A 70-foot-high obelisk, at the time the largest funeral monument in America, was erected there. John Davison Rockefeller was a giant of American industrial capitalism and exemplified America's Gilded Age in the late 19th century. Influenced in different ways by his mother's Baptist faith and his father's often dubious money-making schemes, Rockefeller became one of the richest men in history by creating a monopoly out of America's fledgling oil industry. While his critics attacked him for nefarious business practices and secretive arrangements which gave him an unfair advantage over his rivals, Rockefeller justified his actions by arguing that they were a necessary expedient to prevent the oil industry from competing itself out of existence. He never managed to create a full monopoly, and his market dominance was gradually eroded by international competition and government intervention at home. After taking a step back from Standard in the 1890s, Rockefeller pursued significant philanthropic projects, and the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and the Rockefeller Foundation continue to flourish in their respective fields over a century later. The Rockefeller family would play a prominent role in American economic and political life in the decades following its patriarch's death. John Jr., his son Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, served as the Republican governor of New York when the World Trade Center was built in 1973 by his brother David. Nelson would be appointed Vice President of the United States by Gerald Ford in 1974, while another brother, Winthrop, served as governor of Arkansas. John Jr.'s grandson, John D. Rockefeller IV, better known as Jay, served as Democratic governor and later senator of West Virginia. Thus, Rockefeller not only built a company that was so large that the U.S. government intervened to break it up into dozens of companies in 1911. He also established one of America's great business and political dynasties. What do you think of John D. Rockefeller? Was he a visionary industrialist who nurtured the development of the American oil industry to supply cheap oil to American consumers and businesses? Or was he a ruthless businessman who resorted to unethical methods and monopolization to drive his competitors out of business? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.